Police officers who have arrested other police officers. What's the story? Cover narcotics detective for the murder of 2 fellow officers. From what I remember, the 2 officers and a technician caught him by surprise while he was stealing from an evidence room. He shot the 2 officers first and his firearm jammed, so the technician escaped. Detective got life in prison and died there. But my dad, who was a cop, he was still working as a full-time cop before switching full-time to firefighting, and made a traffic stop around 11 at night back in the mid-80s. Nicer car, speeding well over the speed limit, so my dad initiates a stop. Before he is out of his cruiser, the driver has what looks like a badge hanging out of the window. My dad walks up, does the usual song and dance, and the driver said, "You obviously can't freaking see who I am." My dad says, "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, I do, and right now I'm conducting a traffic stop." Turns out the driver was a lieutenant colonel in the Ohio State Highway Patrol, which is pretty high up in their rank structure. My dad again asks him for license and insurance, and the guy goes off, threatening to call Dong, as in Dong Celeste, who was governor at the time, and threatening his job, that he was just trying to get back to Columbus after an engagement, and so on. Eventually he calls for backup and has another officer there to witness what was going on. Eventually my dad writes him a ticket, and while still screaming, "Mr. Perling rank," drives away. The next shift my dad gets called in by his assistant chief and is asked about the stop, and apparently the colonel of OSHP was calling him about it. In the end they had to bring in the other officer to write a statement of what went on, and in the end nothing came of it, except the ticket wasn't contested and paid. More cops need to enforce speed limits on each other. It really pisses me off when I see cop cars speeding past me with no lights on, when it's clear they aren't going on a call, they're just driving. It's much less common where I am now, Washington, than it was in the South, where I am from. Officer goes on a blind double date with his roommate. Been at the racetrack drinking, so they take the train to downtown. Everyone is pretty drunk, him in particular, maybe to entertain or show off for his date. He is acting goofy. As everyone is getting off the train, he sees some guy bent over tying his shoes. Rocket scientist decides to leapfrog over the guy, only neither of them have much balance. Probationary cop basically jumps over on the guy and drives his face straight into the pavement because he is too drunk and the guy wasn't expecting it. Everyone jumps up and he starts trying to defuse the situation he just caused. Turns out the guy is a 17-year-old kid heading down to spend the weekend with his grandparents and has 2 broken teeth and a broken nose. The drunk cop starts saying stuff like, "It's okay, it will be fine, I'm a cop, it's all good." When he realizes the crowd isn't going to let him just walk away, he foot bails and tries to run off. A few guys chase him down and grab him. Cops get called and detain him. I was the on-call detective who was called out at 2230 to handle the case. He refused to answer any questions and was booked in for felony battery based on the extent of injuries and age of victim. He never made it off probation and resigned. What a freaking idiot. Police officer, but I worked as a contractor for a law enforcement's digital evidence lab. There was a new guy who had just retired as a cop but came on because he wanted to do computer forensics and supposedly had some background in it. We were in training together learning about cell phone forensics when he missed a day of training. That night he was on the news because he had been arrested after cops closed in on him for soliciting texts or pictures from underage girls. We weren't part of the investigation but did send his work computer over to the lab that was working on it, and he had pee on it. Overall we were all shocked but also couldn't not chuckle at the irony that he was a Compat 6 forensics analyst who didn't know how to hide evidence on a computer. I've had to arrest 3 separate members of the justice system this year. First, a practicing lawyer and former judge who had been utilizing his position to coerce sex from defendants. He utilized this leverage even after he was not a judge anymore. Investigation by DCI revealed he had about a dozen victims, so a warrant for his arrest was made, which I executed. Arresting a guy who used to put defendants in front of is a very odd feeling. He weaseled out of prison time and got it all suspended and put on a direct supervision probation program. Absolute horse crap. I've seen guys do way less get way more time, but it's not really a secret that money has a habit of tipping the scales of justice. Next was a prison guard whom strangled his girlfriend, then stalked her relentlessly. I actually arrested him twice because after he posted bail on the first one he was spotted lurking outside her home only 45 minutes after being released. He's currently in on felony assault, strangulation of a household member, and felony violation of a protection order. He's still in my jail awaiting trial with a bail that has been substantially increased. I'm anticipating prison time for him, but only time will tell. Third was a city police officer. I'm a county deputy sheriff because we received a call from a 6-year-old that his dad was in the garage doing drugs and wouldn't come out. Showed up to find 4 very young kids running around unsupervised. It was a city police officer smoking M that he had confiscated during a traffic stop and not reported or turned into evidence. DCI took the case from us due to potential conflict of interest and have placed him in another county's jail, and I haven't heard any more about it. Hope he does time too. What kind of butthole leaves his little kids totally alone and unsupervised while they smoke M? Especially when said person is a frickin' cop. Unforgivable in my opinion. But yeah, 2020 has been a very strange year for me. Wow, very similar thing happened to a judge in Nashville too. He even went so far as to make a call to let a personal acquaintance out of holding, who then went back to the wife who reported him and almost beat her to death. Night about a domestic. Upon arrival, this woman was bleeding heavily from her face. Said her boyfriend was a cop and he was in the next room. We talked to him and he tells us to how she deserved it. Had to use force on him and get him in custody. Guy had close to 8 years on. Fired on the spot by IAD when they arrived. Frick him. I have no sympathy for women beaters. This is so common here in Brazil. It's so sad. The military police ignores whatever crimes their policemen commit and the story only ends when the abused woman ends up dead. Cop for a medium-sized city PD. I have arrested 2 officers for AOE, 1 from my department. I arrested an LT for domestic assault, and 1 more officer for retail fraud. Never faced any backlash. Wasn't fired or written up. Up 1 for a DUI. Dude was passed out in his car at a red light. He worked for my department. I knew him but not too well. Came up to me and apologized a few months later, which I didn't expect. Nice enough fella. Good ending. Was local PD and told me a story about a fellow officer who was molesting his stepdaughter, 11 years old. They asked who was going to arrest him and all of the local PD officers refused, my cousin included. They had to call in the state police after the sheriff's department also refused to arrest. My cousin didn't understand my outrage at the story. I would have one less cousin. That's a full-on cut contact. Sheriff's deputy here. One night on shift I had the great misfortune to overhear on the radio that a small local chief of police, the whole department was only 3 people, was not answering a radio call. So my shift partner goes out to the call that they were trying to get him to go to, and I make my way to try and locate this chief of police. On my way to the police station thinking maybe he's just asleep on the couch, I see his squad car pulled off onto the side of the road, lights going. In that moment my heart sank. My first thought was, oh no, this dude just got killed on a traffic stop. As I'm walking up to the car in a hurry, I noticed that he slumped over. I reached into the open driver's window and grabbed his shoulder to try and put my fingers against his neck to feel if he has a pulse or if his skin is still warm, and generally check to see if he is in fact still alive. As I'm doing this I notice a distinct and strong odor of alcohol. As the chief of police wakes up, looks at me, puts the car and drive and pulls away. About that time another deputy pulls up behind my car, and I put out my radio that the chief is driving off. The other deputy, forgetting that we all use a shared frequency, then comes over the radio and says hey, he should be easy to follow, his lights are on. The lights go off. Fast forward to several hours later. Command staff is out at the police department, seizing the weapons and evidence that's stored within the department. This chief of police shows up with the mayor of the small town and submits himself to a breathalyzer. He barely passes. Fun fact, district attorneys do not like prosecuting chiefs of police, especially when politics are starting to get involved. Unrelated to that, I was let go about 2 weeks later for calling a suspect and butthole. Unprofessional conduct. But an uncle arrested an officer from another city for drunk driving, claiming to be the head of that city's police department. Head of the offending officer is my other uncle, first uncle's brother, who was actually sitting in my uncle's patrol car before the off-duty police officer was tagged. That must have been awkward. Police officer, but I'm a nurse and work intake at a county jail, and I've mostly seen officers arrested for domestic violence and DUI. I also worked with a deputy who was arrested for human trafficking. I'll never understand human trafficking. Sure, it's lucrative, but you have to be seriously depraved or emotionally dead to sell a person. To all you Leos who have done this, it serves no one to let cops get off free of punishment. More than once as a kid I'd be riding in the car with my dad, a Leo, and he'd be on his second six-pack of the day. He'd get pulled over for weaving etc. Then nothing. Dude was driving with 3 minors in the car, drunk enough to get pulled over for it, and let go every time. BC, he was a Leo too. Still makes me mad. But my brother, there have been a couple of DUIs that he's arrested other cops for, and a fine issued against a cop throwing a house party during lockdown. The most interesting, stupid on the part of the other cop, was arresting a cop for assaulting a police officer. If you're a cop, don't go to a club and get drunk enough to lamp your own sergeant in the face when he's on duty and there to break up the fight you are already in. It won't end well for you. If you're too drunk to recognize your boss, being arrested will probably save you from liver failure. I've been a half bottle deep into Jack Daniels and still saw my boss coming across the hotel lobby I used to travel for a living. Arrested 4 separate officers during my career. All 4 were sex crimes. To be fair, special victims were my forte and internal investigations fell under my title, so it just shook out that way. Go into much detail, but had to book an officer in for taking his female roommate's phone and sending her nudes to his own phone. He then threatened to leak them unless she did sexual favors for him, but she called it in instead. Brave woman. Yes, I know, but this is a hilarious story. The city police department had gotten their first internet computer in the early 2000s. And one of the 2 female officers was having trouble with the computer. She had spent an hour screaming, hitting and yelling at it before pulling her gun out and shooting the computer. The other female officer, who is my sister's future mill, had to take her down and arrest her for unlawful use of a service weapon and destruction of municipal property. The charges were dropped because she asked if she could instead quit without her pension and benefits and go to therapy. Now she's been living life as a grandmother and helping kids with anger issues. Another issue, more serious. An officer, same PD, was charged and convicted of unlawfully manufacturing and selling firearms. He was building rifles and pistols and was using a pawn shop to help sell them because they had an FFL, Federal Firearms License, and was forcing the owner to sell him parts for a cheaper price. He was also found to be selling the drugs he took off of people. The police department has taken so many hits from these incidents that the city forces them to have multiple cameras in the cars. All officers have to have body cameras they can't turn off unless they're going to the bathroom, which they have to do in the department. They also can't have their guns directly on them at their desks. They have to be locked in a safe next to their desk to deter them from pulling it out and shooting a computer. I have decided not to work there and to find employment with a department that has a better reputation, which sadly is hard. I'm still stuck on had gotten their first internet computer in the early 2000s. Head of the unit dealing with sexual offenses and child protection. We served a number of police precincts, called a cluster. A young woman was arrested for theft at one of the police stations that resorted under us. Her mother was the complainant. The daughter had a serious substance addiction and had previously stolen from her mother, who gave her a last warning after the second to last time. A substantial, for them, amount of cash had gone missing, and, when confronted by her mother, the daughter denied any knowledge of it. So, deciding that it was time for tough love, she took her daughter to the police station, opened a case and had her arrested. Later that evening, the mother discovered that, instead of hiding the money in the inside pocket of the coat which was hanging in her wardrobe, she had inserted the envelope containing the cash into the coat sleeve. In other words, no theft had taken place. She immediately returned to the police station, explained to them what had happened, made a withdrawal statement and was told her daughter would be released imminently, but that, because the case docket was already with the detectives, only they could release her, and not the informed police in the charge office. Enter the rotten apple of a detective. Upon hearing that a withdrawal statement had been made, he booked the suspect out of the cells and took her to his office, where he told her that he could make the case go away if she did something nice for him in return. He then talked her into having sex with him, following which he had her released from custody. Only upon returning home and hearing her mother's profuse apology did the daughter realize what had happened. Cue the rape complaint, the case docket of which ended with me. Long story short, we summarily arrested the detective, a seasoned veteran of more than 15 years service, recovered the used condom in his office and he was convicted. I don't remember the exact sentence, but it was in excess of 10 years. How was someone who was that horrible allowed to work that job for 15 years? You can't possibly believe that was the first crime he committed. Video where this police officer killed his ex-wife cause she was trying to divorce him and she had a really nice life insurance. He was struggling hella hard with bills and apparently the crime split the whole police department up. People who thought he was guilty versus people who couldn't believe it and thought he wasn't guilty. In the end he was caught cause he was the only one who had keys to the car she drove and the police found a paper with calculations on it that were how much he would have left over after the life insurance money paid off his debts in his house. Oh, and he was sleeping around with a co-worker, lol. To work for the police and arrested a few cops. First one was my first shift ever on the beat. I was walking around the city and had a complaint about an abusive guy who was calling women ass and yelling about how ugly they are. I wasn't too fazed, I thought he was probably just a drunk. As we walked over to speak with the guy he started yelling about how he was in his right and we all agreed. You can have an opinion but just keep things quiet. It was a very simple conversation and after taking his details to issue a ticket, he just snapped. He threw his briefcase at my partner and kicked him in the junk. Well, we had warrant for arrest so took him down and cuffed him. As we took him down his glasses broken on his face and cut him up a bit. Nothing major so we took him back to the holding cell. At this point he said to me, did you know I have a 12-inch dong and my real name is Joe Big Blow? We all had a laugh. I finally got some time to run his name through the system and boom. Police inspector. This is one of the highest ranks in Vic Paul. So being an inspector I called my boss. She came in and said, oh frick. This guy used to teach at the academy, then he runs at her and tries to headbutt her. That doesn't go well and he ends up on the ground with a big lump on his head. Someone gave him a wall to headbutt instead. After a few hours he sobered up and was sent home. The court case carried on for 3 years. I've since left the force and he was fired shortly after that altercation. But I haven't seen anyone mention the video from a few years ago when the female cop ran down another cruiser that was going way over the speed limit and didn't have its lights on or call in anything. I don't recall names, but she saw another cruiser burning down the highway and took off after him. She followed him for a few miles and finally got him to pull over. Once they stopped, she got out and pulled her gun, ordering him to get out over the speaker. He bitched but finally got out and she put him on the ground and in the back of her cruiser. The dude had no reason to be going that fast and was doing it just because he was a cop and thought he could. It was national news when it happened and, if I remember correctly, thousands of police departments across the country were doing illegal record checks on her, which goes into a system. But that'll come later. And she was getting death threats in her mail from police officers everywhere. I don't recall what led to the discovery, but she found out about the illegal background checks on her and won a ridiculous amount of lawsuits. I'm gonna go look for the article and post it here if I find it. Feel free to link it if someone finds it before me. Actual cops, so I'll give an answer. I've arrested 12 cops for DUI, 2 of which included charges of possessing weapons while intoxicated. I've arrested 1 cop for writing a check on a closed account, another for violating protection order during a very ugly divorce. I assisted the feds on a couple tax-related arrests. I've also arrested a total of 3 cops for dereliction of duty. One of those cops was a cop who didn't arrest or conduct a DUI investigation after a crash involving another cop. All those cases proceeded in a similar fashion as other people with similar backgrounds criminal records would have with similar offenses. The slap on the wrist is actually very common and the norm with first time offenders. Also the things I've found cops arrested for are generally the same things other middle class blue collar workers get in trouble for. Issues with substance abuse, particularly alcohol, and financial problems. My career is perfectly fine. I've faced absolutely no negative repercussions from any of my peers. I'd say if you work for a large enough agency you've probably arrested or written a ticket to a cop. Dispatcher who filed a complaint against another dispatcher for jeopardizing public and officer safety. This person did not like me and would intentionally withhold information and not enter it into CAD, causing me on radio to have delays in responding to officer questions. When I finally had enough and reported this person to Assistant Chief, I was sent home. 2 days later I was fired for abandoning post even though I never left. I called both the chief and the assistant chief out during my termination for this being a case of good old boys and collected my personal belongings. To this day people ask me all the time why is it when they call 911 at this particular city they get told hold. My response is usually that dispatcher is most likely finishing their game of Candy Crush first. The thin yellow line, dispatchers, and I hear the thin blue line, cops, are to never be crossed. You're either with them or against them. And arrested an officer that took a runaway minor in exchange for sexual favors. Dude was an officer placed at the kid's school. Kid was a missing teenage boy, like 16 or 17. Cop was getting him drugs and alcohol. 2. Hubs was put on the missing persons case. Once the parents reported him missing, he was supposed to have gone with friends for spring break. It was pretty fast, like 2-3 days. All the kid's friends knew. Cop had a party house for minors. Basically, creep. The police officers who are willing to rightfully arrest other police officers. I have more respect for you than you could ever imagine. The officers under me had a mental breakdown and shot his supervisor. It took 3 guys to take him down. Cops really should have frequent mental capacity assessments. New to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video.